Hi, I'm Cameron Foster. I'm the program coordinator for Millions of Conversations. Welcome to our October 2021 Conversationalist series event, Displacement and Climate Disasters. For those of you not yet familiar with us, Millions of Conversations is a national organization headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. Our mission is to transcend divides by uniting people around common values for a shared future. And part of how we do this is through our semi-monthly Conversationalist series events. This is where we bring together experts with audiences in order to model productive conversations around crucial issues. These events are designed to be interactive, so remember to stay online after today's conversation to participate in our breakout sessions, and feel free to drop any questions you might have for our speakers into the chat box throughout today's events. This event is coming in the midst of a pretty bad year for climate disasters in Tennessee, across the country, and across the globe. Our speakers and our moderator for today's events, as well as myself, have all been affected by climate displacement. And today, we're all going to come together from different parts of the US to discuss how these issues affect people in our communities and what needs to be done to turn productive conversations into action. Joining us today are Jody Stewart from the New Jersey Organizing Project and Vanderbilt student activist Luis Martínez. Jody is a Superstorm Sandy survivor from coastal New Jersey who became a full-time organizer for disaster relief and environmental justice after losing her home to the storm 9 years ago today, as of tomorrow. And Luis is a senior studying Latin American history and Spanish and Portuguese at Vanderbilt, and was inspired to get involved in environmental activism on campus by the millions of immigrants in his home city to oppose democratic breakdown and climate inaction. Moderating today's discussion is Remziya Suleyman, our COO at Millions of Conversations, and a lifelong community organizer who has worked to mobilize flood relief efforts in Nashville immigrant and refugee communities. Remziya, I'll turn it over to you to get us started, but first let's do a quick poll to kick off this event. All right, so you should see the poll pop up on screen right now if you'll just take 1 minute to vote. Okay, and I'll turn it over to you, Remziya.
All right, thank you, Cameron. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. As Cameron mentioned, my name is Remziya Suleyman. I am the Chief Operations Officer here at Millions of Conversation. So tonight's conversation isn't to be a part of the rhetoric that you hear traditionally. Our goal is not to feed into polarized rhetoric. Our goal for her tonight is to really have a conversation about the human effects of climate disasters and how communities can come together to organize during these challenging times. As many of you know, nearly 1 in 3 Americans experience a climate disaster this summer. Environmental disasters have displaced over 1 million Americans each year. And according to the Washington Post, from June to September, over 388 people in the United States died because of climate disasters. This is the reality of what we're facing. These stats are not just stats. These are people, these are our fellow neighbors, our community members. And so for us tonight, we want to give you an opportunity to hear folks who have been directly affected by climate disasters, but what they're doing to organize in their own communities. So I'll turn it off real quickly. Jody and Luis, thank you again for being here tonight. Can you talk a little bit about how climate disasters have affected your life and how it has led you to organizing? And Jody, we'll kick it off with you.
Thank you. I say this in the most profound way, I'm a Superstorm Sandy survivor. It'll be 9 years tomorrow that I lost my home to the storm, and it took me 3 years to get back home. And I was one of the lucky ones. I was just an average person who worked in bait and tackle. I had no idea what organizing is, and I imagine most people don't. But through me not being able to recover, I found a whole organization of people that were just building up. They had a meeting I attended, and they kept on me to keep attending. And it finally hit me one day. This is what we need to do. We need to band together to get any change in life. People weren't getting home until we banded together. And the creation of NJOP has only been 7 years. So we went 2 years after the disaster with not getting home. And as a matter of fact, as I looked out my door today, I'll let you know the tide was in my street already. It seems like every year this time, the trauma comes back to us all because of climate change. We're seeing it. And just this past couple months ago, we had Tropical Storm Ida come through, and we lost 30 people in New Jersey due to drowning in cars and in basements apartments. Climate change affects every way I think. I quit my job to be an organizer, and every day I fight for disaster survivors and to make sure we do something in New Jersey to slow down our carbon footprint, because we're right on the leading edge of climate change. I think we're the third state in the country. It's a scary world what we're doing right now. But we're going through trauma right now in this state, most of us survivors, because of tomorrow. So
Wow.
thank you.
No, Jody, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. What an incredible story. Luis, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Luis Martínez. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm from Miami, Florida. My late father was a Cuban exile, and my mom is a Venezuelan immigrant. And I come from a city, as you all might know, Miami is the largest Latin majority county in this half of the country. And Miami also is part of a 6 million person metropolitan area that has a very disproportionately large share of immigrants and of children of immigrants. So ultimately, what drives me forward is a moral obligation I have to combat the forces that have afflicted the communities of my heart back in my home city and region. And as a first generation Cuban Venezuelan American, I've grown up seeing and hearing and suffering like secondhand and vicariously through the stories of my family members and the stories of all of the immigrants who raised me. So ultimately, I do not have a story of immense personal suffering and trauma like Jody's, and I do not pretend to, but I do speak here today, and I do the work I do in my life in honor of the immigrants who have raised me and who've given me all the love possible, and who have worked to forge a new home in South Florida after having lost their homes once throughout the Americas. And ultimately, what we're trying to do throughout these conversations is work to make sure that they do not become refugees again, because my home region is one of the most endangered places in the Americas because of sea level rise and other climatic disasters and catastrophes. So thank you all today, and I'm very excited to share insights I've acquired throughout my time here studying at Vanderbilt and throughout my life as a Miamian.
And Luis, you mentioned some great points. We'll come back to the global context of climate disaster, as well as the story of how do you organize in communities with people of various ethnic, religious, socioeconomic status, and what are some challenges we face there. But we'll get back to that in just a moment. I want to go into kind of one of the areas where you see a lot of information and disinformation about, one that's very controversial. Sometimes it really divides us as communities. And that's the role of government. Where does the role of government play in supporting recovery? What does our broken recovery system look like? But really, what role does our government have to play in continued crisis of disaster displacement? And before I open it up to Jody, I think I'll open this question up to you. I want to set the tone and say that we understand that no matter the amount of investment that's put into the infrastructure, it won't solve all the issues. However, we understand that it will make it a little less challenging. So could you talk a little bit about just the broken system? What role does our government, what responsibility they have for this?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the government has a lot of responsibility. Now, when our major disaster hit in the state of New Jersey, as any state will tell you they're prepared, Florida should be more than any state. They are not prepared whatsoever how to handle that. And that includes the federal government and FEMA. They have no clue what they're doing. They come in doing protocol and telling people to do things that do not work. Superstorm Sandy survivors were told to apply for an SBA loan immediately. Loans that most of us couldn't get anyhow because we weren't eligible. But if we got that loan, it was a hazard. It was a problem just for state grant programs because they called it duplication of benefits then. So the federal government doesn't work hand in hand with the state. And when the state programs finally start in any disaster, it's months later. It's 6 months later. By time you have people now living on the street because they can't get back in their homes. They're losing their homes to foreclosures. The government does not properly come and back up. They're broken. They should give the people with the experience, which is survivors, the right to help make those decisions. I have seen until this day still, the government doing it totally wrong. And I can't say they're trying their best. I just feel it's broken. They look at numbers, they don't look at people. And that's the main thing. Let's take care of the people, not the numbers.
Yeah, I think the prevention process, right? What we saw in Texas, what we've seen in places even in Waverly, Tennessee with the recent flooding is that the governments are just not prepared. Even when they're given advance notice, even though they know this is happening, we see a lack of infrastructure prep. One of the important kind of, as I was preparing for tonight's event, what struck me as I was doing research was realizing that the research that's been out there, half of the public roadways are currently in poor or mediocre condition. And this isn't just coming from me, but this is coming from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Our underfunded stormwater systems. I mean, these are all areas that could be invested in, that should be invested in, but it's taking a long time to really get there. And so that's leading to further displacement, that's leading to further, in a way, deaths, and really challenging how communities can rebuild. The next question, I want to move on to Luis, because I think we talk about the role of federal government has to play in prevention and infrastructure. But we also understand that climate crisis is not just about climate alone, right? It affects our everyday way of life, and it affects our foreign policy, it affects our healthcare, it affects our education. Just broaden our view just a little bit on this topic a little bit for us, from the US to the America as a whole, places like Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela. What intersections exist between the climate crisis and refugee crisis, and how does displacement affect immigrant communities?
Of course, thank you. So I'd just like to provide some brief and I guess condensed considerations of several different countries that I've either studied or have personal connections to or have done advocacy work related to. So first, I'd like to discuss Cuba. So, I'm Cuban American, so I have been hearing and reading about this my whole life. And just to provide a little bit of historical periodization, following the Spanish-Cuban American War in 1898, Cuba was under US protectorate status for a couple of decades, and that very prolonged sense of US interventionism on the island fostered a lot of anti-imperialist sentiment. And then the Cuban Revolution arose as a result of that, among other factors. And the single party state that has been in existence since 1959 is known for a variety of rights abuses, not the least of which is environmental negligence and lack of proper conduct on climate action. But at the same time, Cuba is also an island that has very little ability to actually shift the gears on global emissions, just because of its small stature as an island that just does not produce a large fraction of those emissions, either per capita or nationally. So this is like an entire moral calculation for the entire region of the Americas and for the globe. It's not something Cuba can handle by itself, or it's not something Cuba should handle by itself. So I'll just outline some climate specific problems when it comes to Cuba and its national response, which has been relatively sturdy on climate change. So weather unpredictability is something that's really striking at the heart of the Cuban nation today. Abnormal climatic behavior and crop and food insecurity has really driven Cuba to a point of environmental instability, especially when you start combining that with other environmental catastrophes afflicting the region because of climate instability. So Cuba is an agroecological state as opposed to the US's agrarian industrial model. So the Cuban economy and people, as a consequence, are heavily dependent on climatic trends and predictability for survival. So the cultivation of sugarcane, tobacco, coffee, and other very crucial crops on the island makes it such that when climate change starts introducing that level of unpredictability on the island, the levels of extreme poverty and government repression are exacerbated because the people have less way to even grow the food that they can grow. Another major aspect comes into play is tropical cyclone intensification. So tropical depressions, storms, hurricanes, and typhoons, the latter of which does not happen in this part of the world, as we know. Those are all major climatic disasters that affect the island. And, for example, Irma is one of the hurricanes I remember most profoundly as a South Floridian. When I was a senior in high school, I wasn't in school for a month and a half because Irma just devastated South Florida. And we had the financial infrastructure to respond to it, but places like Cuba and Haiti and other places in the Caribbean typically don't. So Irma made landfall with winds of nearly 160 miles per hour, making it the first Category 5 hurricane to hit Cuba since 1937. And there's also this problem, to speak more to governmental responses to climate disaster and management. There's also this gender dimension that's often neglected in conversations about Cuba and many Caribbean island nations when it comes to climatic disasters. So the Cuban women's burden during climatic disaster is that women are more vulnerable to climate change because of societal structures and expectations that hold Cuba's women to a higher and more perilous level of domestic responsibility when it comes to protecting the family and protecting other individuals in her local community when it comes to natural disasters. So a quote from a research paper I wrote about Cuba and climate change is, women are overburdened with work. The care of children and older adults, food and water shortages falls on them frequently. So there's this dimension of disaster relief and management from a gender perspective. And finally, the topic that really makes me feel really sensitive to climate change as a South Floridian and someone who's the son of a Cuban and Venezuelan immigrant. So sea level rise and coastal flooding is really something that horrifies anyone who's mildly related to the Caribbean and who has knowledge of the issue. The average sea level rise in Cuba would be 27 centimeters by 2050 at this currently unmitigated pace, 85 centimeters by 2100, and that would submerge the entirety of low-lying coastal areas on the island. And even though the Cuban government's response is relatively sturdy as opposed to its response on other rights-related issues, it has a national action plan for the combat of desertification and drought that it formulated in 2000, and it has a Tarea Vida initiative. It has lots of different kinds of national plans, which are really effective, but just because of the polluter pays principle, that burden should not fall on the island nation of Cuba or on its people, just because they cannot simply mitigate to the extent that is necessary to actually rail against these massive climatic problems. I don't know if there's enough time, but if you'd like me to speak about Venezuela, Puerto Rico, and some other countries, I can do that too. But I think Cuba's a great case study for thinking about this, and a really tragic example of what's going to happen to a lot of these countries in the world today.
Yeah, and I think, you talk about Cuba. I think for me, what's been fascinating to watch in the news is how we have reacted to the Haitian migrant crisis and our government's insistence on actually deporting these individuals or not allowing them to seek asylum and having them forced to return back to Haiti. When the devastation is still apparent, Haiti's still trying to rebuild. I think one of the interesting issues that keeps coming up is the compounding climate disasters, right? No longer are we having one climate disaster at a time. You're having multiple disasters hit certain regions at the same time. So I think, you kind of set the stage a little bit about the national context, but I want to get us into a little bit more about how do we organize around environmental policies? How do we start having conversations within our communities, within diverse communities around this issue, around these topics that move us away from polarization? And specifically, what role does propaganda play? Whether that's propaganda and misinformation and disinformation from the government, from social media, but what do we do on a localized level? And before I turn out, Luis, I'll start with you on this one, and then Jody will go to you. I want to share a stat that I think is fascinating. And this kind of tells you where we are as a nation and how we continue to be divided on policy issues, on topics where I think we shouldn't be this divided and polarized. So for example, the Gallup poll this year found that a record high of 82% of Democrats said the effects of global warming had already begun, whereas only 29% of Republicans felt the same way. So, that tells you right there that there's also a lot of disinformation that's causing polarization. So what do we do? How do we organize in our communities? How do we work on a local level to move away from the polarization to address the issue? Luis, I'll hand it off to you.
Of course. I'm just going to refrain from mincing words. I'm going to try to speak about this as objectively as possible, just from a database perspective. I'm from South Florida, as I've said, and South Florida is a really politically complex area that is naturally bound to happen when you have hundreds of thousands of people, each from different national immigrant groups. So really something that really strikes at the heart of Miami is its political composition and those tensions. So for example, if anyone knows and follows Miamian politics, Cuban and Venezuelan immigrants are known for being more right-wing leaning. Other South American immigrants are known for being more left-wing leaning. Central Americans are split, for example, one's from Nicaragua because of the left-wing regime there, they might be more right-wing leaning in the US today, things like that. So ultimately what happens though is there's this discourse in the US today of mostly promoted by the Democratic National Committee and other Democratic national establishments that just because you're a minority of some sort, you're bound to vote blue. And that's a very big assumption. And that's something that's imposed unilaterally on South Florida's immigrant communities. And then when they don't vote blue, they're the object of national scorn, mostly from Democrats. So there are some assumptions, and there's a lack of active discourse and active listening and active consideration of why those people behave in the political directions they behave in. So, I think about this in a really nuanced and complex way because I won't look at a Venezuelan in Miami who votes red and think, oh, they're voting red because, of all these reasons when they weren't raised in this country, they don't have a lot of the political information that other Americans have, and they were raised in a different context, one of possible generational trauma from a left-wing regime. So there are a lot of different variables you have to take into account. So ultimately, I'm a firm proponent of the following things. I'm a firm proponent of grassroots organizing and Spanish language activism and communication and discourse across cultural and national lines. If you don't speak to these immigrant communities in Spanish, you're not going to reach them because they're going to view you as some American coming to impose your political will on them, without actually working to understand their political background or their culture or their national origins. This is something really, really important now that I've set up the political stage. This is something really important for discussions on climate and on climate justice. Many Miamians simply do not understand the fact that Miami is the most endangered city in the Americas insofar as sea level rise is concerned and massive loss of cultural heritage and population is concerned. But at the same time, if there's a lack of democratic national outreach to those immigrant communities, and there's just an underlying assumption that, oh, they're immigrants, they're Latino, they speak Spanish, they're going to vote blue, then we need to, let me be a little more meta. The whole point of this panel is to focus on the value of conversations across lines of identity and nationality and ethnicity and religion and culture. So I'd just like to emphasize that that's probably the best way to go about this, just speaking avidly and working to communicate from an angle of understanding.
Thank you, Luis. Jody, when we spoke earlier this week, you had a fascinating conversation that you brought up specifically around some events and policy work that you all were doing, and how you all have been successfully to move beyond the political lines and engage in a bipartisan way on this topic. Can you talk a little bit about that for us tonight?
Sure, I can. The one thing about our organization, first, I do want to say, Luis, I agree with you. And I'd love to talk to you further, by the way. I just got to get that out. Our organization is nonpartisan, and we push for that reason, because disaster hits all people. But we don't use the word climate change, first of all, especially on a bipartisan level, because just what you said, Republicans, unfortunately, don't want to hear that. They associate that word with Democrat. And nowadays, the Republicans are so conservative, it doesn't work. We use words like sea level rise. We meet them where they're at, especially when you live in communities like Miami, New Jersey, at the shore. We can speak about things that they can feel and touch. But I will also tell I'm a progressive Republican. And the reason I call myself a progressive Republican is I have always been a member of the Republican Party, but have very progressive thinking. And that gets me also through the doors to talk to Republicans who normally would not speak to regular people. They will not speak to anyone on socialism, because socialism, bah humbug-ish, not knowing that's totally ridiculous, or Democrats. So they'll let me in the door to talk to them, and being able to talk to them also gets them motivated to push on the issues that we believe in. Offshore wind is something we're fighting for the state of New Jersey, because we're a firm believer, and that will help cut the carbon footprint so we can continue living at the Jersey Shore. And we have, as a matter of fact, one of our local Republican representatives leading that with our Democratic governor. So that is something that we're very fortunate. We just make sure that we keep everyone together to be able to work together as a team, especially when it's things that are important to us. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't happen all the time. There are some people who do not care, even they'll look at me and they won't speak to me just because they don't trust me because of the word progressive added in there. But in our state, whenever especially it's something with sea level rise, extreme weather, or disasters, we found we can meet all of our representatives and have a seat at the table with them and work with them. And they're gladly right there working with us, especially, as I said, with climate. They're all on board with it. And when it comes to any kind of disaster relief, which is something we are going to be working with for the rest of our life now, because it's going to be happening just as frequently, hopefully not as much as Miami has to go through with storms, but New Jersey is now becoming squishy. We'll call it squishy. So, yes.
So before we get on to the next question about what can we do at a local level, what can folks on this call do in their own communities? Luis, I want to kind of come back to you for just a second. I think Jody brought up a great point about how do you work across political lines, but one thing that we are moving into is that the United States, it's going to be a majority minority country, right? And the language access, language barrier continue to be an issue. How do we talk to those in our communities where there's a language barrier? How do you get them to move beyond the conversation? And I say this because when I did some organizing in Tennessee, people were just trying to survive day to day. When you went in and talked about climate change or policy change, for them, their thought is, what do I do today to get food on the table? Or the conversation is for them, it's so grand that they're thinking, all right, that's a few years, or that's a decade, or that's not my lifetime. How do we have conversations for those immigrant communities where there is a language barrier?
That's the exact question we all need to be asking on a national level, especially because I'm going to use a brief anecdote to explain this. After, I don't know if you all followed like the election news, like the nights after the first day of voting this past cycle, but you know, when people saw how Miami voted, which was still blue, but by a much smaller margin, you know, a bunch of CNN commentators were just saying, oh, this is so confusing. I'm so shocked. I don't understand. This is so strange. A bloodbath for Democratic Party of Florida, et cetera. Ultimately, that just displays to me that people are latching on to this trope of Latinos in the US being monolithic, and that you can generalize that to a broader understanding of all minority communities in the US being monoliths. And there's this very unilateral, unidimensional American perception of minorities in this country as people who have a singular political views. So although, you know, generally most minorities, if you tallied them, would vote blue as opposed to not, like that makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, considering the GOP structural injustices. At the same time, it's important for us to come from a perspective of understanding specific national histories, specific cultural implications. So ultimately, my first suggestion would be dispelling the monolith trope, not assuming that just because someone's Latin and they speak Spanish and are an immigrant from South America, Central America, the Caribbean, that they have a certain political disposition. That's just not going to work in a lot of cases. You know, whether you're Nicaraguan, Venezuelan, Honduran, Bolivian, it just does not work in a lot of cases. Working to understand national histories, and if you're participating in 501c3 organizations or in other civil society spheres, making sure that you're hiring people or working with people, volunteers maybe, who speak Spanish, who speak other languages related to those immigrant populations you're working with. And then finally, I'm going to piggyback a little bit off Jody's advice, which is being careful about what perspective you're speaking from and who you're presenting yourself as. Because if you're presenting yourself as a hyper-partisan organizer and you know that community is bound to not be receptive to those views, then maybe just for the sake of seeking greater compromise in the country, just for one moment, just to move the pegs a little bit further, you can set aside a little bit of that moral passion, which that's really hard for me to do, for example, because, you know, when I hear anyone start to infringe on, like, you know, certain core convictions I have, I start getting nervous and start feeling insulted. But just for the sake of organizing and reaching more people, it's important to just present yourself from a more objective perspective, because ultimately we don't have time to waste. And we want to reach as many people as possible. And yeah, there are big counter arguments you can make against what I'm saying, but at the same time, I just really think it's important for you to set aside a little bit of that moral flair and ultimately to the same end as you would have kept that moral flair, speak to people more decisively and from a more objective and calmer personal perspective, where you can empathize with their national and specific cultural circumstances.
Yeah. And I think, you know, a lot of the communities, specifically, I'm talking right now about communities in Tennessee and Nashville, where I did a lot of my organizing work, came from communities where there was a lot of mistrust from government, where they fled persecution, where they fled a lot of dangerous things that happened in their home countries. And now we're bringing them here and for kind of telling them you should trust the government, you should trust these entities. And one thing that I realized is that as you organize around any topic, I think the messengers are key. You need to make sure that people who understand the communities are doing outreach to the communities. You need to make sure that individuals who speak the language, who dialect, these are all important things that help build trust. And I think that's the kind of main point of how do we get beyond the rhetoric, is building trust within our communities. And sometimes that has to do with having the right messengers. And so what do we do? What can we do? How do we organize around such a topic? How do we get involved on local climate organizing? I'd love to hear from both of you all. And I think the reason why it's so important to hear a little bit more about what you're doing and how we can get involved is that because the role that social systems play in recovery. Communities with stronger social systems bounce back quicker and stronger when there's a climate disaster. When there's warning systems, when there's check-ins from neighbors, this has been proven to have saved hundreds of lives. And we'll go into kind of the effects of climate disaster and displacement on local communities. But Jody, can you tell us a little bit about how we can get involved with what you're doing and with the New Jersey Organizing Project, as well as what are some tips folks can take away from this call?
Oh, that's amazing that you bring that up. And again, I started out not being an organizer. As a matter of fact, I guess it was always in my heart to do some change, but most of us don't know how or even where to start. And so it took a disaster. It took trauma. Let me put it better, trauma, to get involved organizing. But the most important thing is being on the ground, being very honest with people, understanding what they're saying, but you also have to be accessible. There's one problem a lot of people don't realize is how do we meet the people where they're at? Our organization is the community we're from, the county where we're from is probably 80%, 85% white. Our organization is 95% white, and that's just how it's made up, though we're expanding out now just because of other disasters and other things and coalitions. So to bring up what Luis says, I've run into that problem of door knocking, where I'm not that person who should be in that community. The mistrust is there, where they see a white woman knocking at a door. Can't do that. You have to have the right people knocking on the door. And the main thing is getting them to trust you. May it be as small as finding out what is needed in the community, a street light turned on, sewer lines cleaned out. Something that small builds trust in communities with people who have no trust for government already. I never trusted a government until I was involved with an organization. So that's the main thing, is stay on the ground, organize with the people who have already experienced some kind of trauma and can relate to you, and you can relate to them, and figure out from there. I started organizing technically with Sandy, but my first organizing campaign was for the Affordable Care Act. I was under attack. They were taking my health care. I could not afford health care. So it was easier to get out there on the street and talk to people. How do we meet you? What is this? Join us, unite with us. One voice no one hears, numerous voices we make change, and we did make change. Many organizations standing together in this state saved the ACA right now. So people like me and many others can have health care and quality health care, not just something second-class citizen, because there is no such thing as second-class citizens. But as I say, we have to be on the ground. We have to meet people where they're at. And that means if their problem is not climate, but another campaign we're involved with, overdose, you go to clinics. You talk to people, the families. You have to be involved. And if you can't communicate with someone properly, you find someone who can. Right now, we're working with IDA folks in communities that we're not aware of, and they don't understand us. So we have that middle person in there, bringing in the trauma together. On the ground, same trauma, same self-interest, organizing. It all blends together.
Great point, Jody. You know, I remember back when the historic flood of 2010 hit Nashville, and a few days after the flood, we realized that some of the hardest hit areas of town were South Nashville, where predominantly immigrant and refugees were placed. And I was at an organization, immigrants' rights organization at that point, and we realized we weren't hearing from the community. We realized something was wrong really quickly. And so what we did, we got on the phone and we did one-on-one check-in with all of our community leaders, every institution, every organization, every leader we knew. We said, what's happening in your community? And then they went in door to door, knocked on doors to check in on their constituents. And we quickly found out, specifically in one area of town, hundreds of refugee Coptic Christian Egyptians who were hardest hit by the flood, who were completely ignored, whose landlord was refusing to provide any services or even let them out of their rental agreements. And so we quickly stepped in, but we also realized that the city was unprepared. So we took a group, hundreds of Coptic refugees one night in emergency response, took them to a shelter. And I get a call at 6 a.m. and they're like, Remziya, we need you to get down here. And so I go down there and everyone has left. And so we're asking what's going on. And a couple of things appeared, and it was things that we learned from there that the city then would go on and implement. Translators were not available. The shelters were not segregated. These individuals came from very conservative backgrounds. They had been in the country less than 2 years. So the recovery mechanism in place did not meet their cultural needs, and they didn't feel safe. And then finally, the leadership was not consulted in a lot of these communities. These communities were really tied to their churches. And the city hadn't done proper outreach to those leaders. And so we were forced to kind of help the city develop a plan to do outreach and get support for immigrant communities. And I think that goes back to building trust and checking on your neighbors, the social systems that are so important, because we know that it's social neighborhoods with the strongest social systems experience less trauma and are better able to get on their feet. So these are just kind of some examples I learned from organizing and kind of disaster relief efforts that we did. But before we kind of conclude our panel, Luis, would you like to add anything about organizing in immigrant communities that you have seen to be effective?
Yeah, I'd really just like to second every single thing Jody said. You're hearing that from a very authentic and highly driven organizer, and we're all blessed to have been able to hear Jody speak in that response. But I'll just add my 2 cents. I think something really effective we can all do is treat this a little bit like the global plastic problem. So when we all think about, those incalculable, very frightening loads of plastic everywhere and what we can do to mitigate our sum waste total, people pick little different ways to do that. So what I'd say to you all in terms of like organizing for climate justice, for immigrant justice, or for these other large problems would be to pick and identify your stake and how you're going to contribute in a sustainable and sustained way throughout your life. So whether it's avocational for you and you go volunteer every weekend in some sort of like immigrant justice or other civil society sphere to help out vulnerable communities in your area, or whether that becomes part of your job, like, for example, our moderators have made this a very deep and evident part of their life. and of their life's mission to help people by contributing to these discussions in the world today. So I would identify your stake and how you plan to contribute and hold yourself to that one standard throughout your life, because I think like service is a really deep part of the human condition and something we should all live to and living our values, you know. And another thing I'd say is ultimately, like, it's not just something you can do. You can't just go and speak to people and assume that you know everything you need to know about their backgrounds and their origins. Even if you speak the language, you might not have the necessary information to speak to the political circumstances they survived in a repressive regime in another part of the Americas, you know? So ultimately, one, like doing some research and being open to learning more about those communities you're there to service. And another thing would be being open to learning more while you're speaking with them. And checking your assumptions at the door and being sure to be very open-minded and frank and engage in some open discourse to like increase that level of trust that Jody alluded to. So that's really important. So ultimately, that's why I really wanted to focus on Latin American history throughout my undergraduate experience, because what better way to help people of the Americas today than to understand the foundations of modern nation states and crises in our region today. So ultimately, that knowledge is really important, and reaching out to people who have that knowledge and then being open to cultivating that knowledge in your own conversations with marginalized communities would be really important. And I'd say those are my main pieces of advice.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for an incredible discussion, for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your know-how with us. We really appreciate you taking the time today to be with us. I know I've learned a lot from this conversation. For those who are on the call, please make sure you check out the New Jersey Organizing Project, as well as the student youth groups that Luis is a part of. We'll put that information in the chat box. Usually after some of these programs, we like to have group discussions. We like to hear from other participants who are joining in and listening into the conversation, and we want to hear your feedback tonight. So I'm going to take the moment to open up the floor. I'll hand it off to Cameron, but I'd love to hear from those of you who are on the call with us tonight. What has resonated with you? What have you learned? What is the takeaway for you from tonight's conversation? And how do we move beyond just conversation and into action?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. This was just such a great event. I'm from the same county that Jody is organizing in right now. So I am a 2-time hurricane survivor, once with Sandy almost 9 years ago, and then more recently with Ida. So getting to hear all of your insights has been just like fantastic to know that there's so many people who actually like really care about getting out on the ground and like solving these crucial issues. So first and foremost, I just want to open it up to our audience. And if you have any insights that you'd like to share after hearing our speakers, please feel free to come off mute and share them with us.
Lynn, I'm going to call on you because I love hearing your feedback from these events. You bring in such a different perspective every time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you can hear me, Lynn, you're on mute.
Oh, are you talking to me?
I'm talking to you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I couldn't hear very well. Well, this was very interesting, and I was sort of processing it through the lens of what's happened in Waverly, Tennessee recently, because that's probably what I know the best of all the. I mean, I've been in Nashville when we had the tornadoes and so on, and the flood in 2010 and all. But I followed the Waverly issues closely because I had friends on Facebook. And so there was a group that we communicated with, you know, regularly. And one of the things that and of course, this is a fairly homogenous community in that there was one African-American woman, Rose, who lived in Erin and who was working down in Humphreys County at a store, and she was drowned. There were a couple of other African-American folks whose houses or apartments were devastated by the flood because it was the apartment buildings in the poorer neighborhoods that, like the housing projects, that were most affected because they were creekside. but it was a fairly homogenous community of, white Southern folks, many of whom have lived in the community for a long, long time. And I noticed this thing that happened over maybe a month that I'm still trying to puzzle through, haven't figured out what happened. Started out love for everyone, help for everyone, let's rescue everyone, let's assist everyone. And then I started seeing some Facebook posts that were kind of snarky, well, like those folks aren't doing their part, or those folks need to do this, or, that kind of thing. And this was, within the community, that this was all local, in-house, so to speak, in community Facebook posts. And I thought how commonly that occurs, that you go from, we're all brothers and sisters together and we have to work together and we're so proud of our local heroes. I mean, we saw this with the healthcare workers, for example, over the COVID crisis. First we all love the healthcare workers and we cheer and we clap for them at night and so on. And then there gets to be this sort of negativity around healthcare workers that came from, as far as I could tell, nowhere. It came out of the blue. And then I saw that happening in the Waverly community some. I'm seeing this secondhand, just on Facebook, basically, or maybe some telephone conversations. And I was trying to figure out what made this happen. I decided so far, I mean, I don't have it in my mind at all how it has happened, but I think fatigue and despair and defeat sets in, and there's a desire then to us and them people, us versus them. And so some of the folks in the community became them, and some of the folks were, it's just us, we're all the good guys. And I really wanted to find a way to intervene in that, because I think that's such a crucial point, and it happened kind of quickly. It happened within a month, I would say within the month. I would love to hear some people talk about your own insights as to where that comes from, if you've experienced it or witnessed it, and what can we do about that? So I don't really have any great insights, but I have noticed that and been concerned about it.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that.
Okay.
I think one of the main problems is, especially with false narratives going out, it's exactly that, false narratives. And so many people, especially, and I don't blame people who get on social media, but a lot of it's done by social media on purpose to give false narratives. So I expect, and what I tell everybody who comes up with these stories of why and what and how, it's to educate yourself properly, but not on social media, because that is number one, don't take it wrong, where different political parties put out their narrative. And if you want to go with climate, we see fossil fuel industry always hiding behind a false narrative and putting it out. So I always tell people kindly and nicely, because you know how explosive things can be, do your own research, get off social media, do it the right way to find out. I will educate you. Narratives, our organization puts out those things. And again, since we're bipartisan, we don't take sides. But I've seen it so frequently, the false narrative going out and the people who fall for it. And it's just very, very sad that people aren't taking that extra step like you have to learn things, to talk things through and find out truth instead of just how it's working out.
Yeah, I can definitely second that, because I live, the place that I grew up in, the place I live with, a coastal New Jersey town. It's a red county in a blue state. And so you can physically watch these narratives take hold. right after the storm, everyone's working together, everyone's trying to get relief for each other, everyone's struggling with getting like FEMA money to repair, everyone's going through these same issues and problems. But then later down the line and later down the line, you're seeing that they're all of a sudden like espousing a completely different narrative, and you wonder where it came from, because it's like, wait a minute, just a couple months ago, we were all talking together about this, we were all trying to work together to make this better, and now all of a sudden you're saying something that goes contrary to your experiences. And so it's not something that just like people randomly decide to believe things, it's something that someone has a vested interest in them believing, you know.
Yeah. Melinda, you have your hand raised. Do you want to go in next? We can't hear you. Okay. Sorry, we can't hear you. Feel free to put it in the chat box. Yeah, thank you. You know, Lynn, you bring up a good point, because I think about my time in organizing, and this comes up a lot, and it's when folks are in survival mode, right? In the beginning, it's about surviving. It's about getting through what they're coming through with everything that's happening. And I think the other thing that finally sets in after some time is frustration, because there are underlying systemic issues that haven't been resolved. And this is very true. For example, you know, when I did organizing in Nashville, and whether it was flood relief or something else for the immigrant communities, you know, around an emergency or crisis, folks were really, you know, ready to help and jumped on board right away. But then when things started to calm down, they were saying, oh, you're asking for too much. You're pushing for too much. But the reality is that these community expected and deserved better. They deserve to be treated just like all the other communities. And I think that's something that comes to head, is that people are then so frustrated with what the systemic injustice is, a systemic whatever you want to define it. I think folks then come to grapple with that and are like, you know what, and this might be the time, and I've gone through this, I've survived the worst. Let's bring this up as well. So I think it's a growing frustration. And Melinda, I hope your mic is set. Let's see, let me take you. Okay. Let's see if you can. Yeah, we still can't hear you. So, okay, you'll type it in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, so Lynn, I think it's a growing frustration with the circumstances that have put him there as well for a lot of these communities, and it's justifiable. So
one of the things I noticed as a response in the Waverly community that I thought was good was I started seeing more and more face-to-face meetings being set up. This church or this community center or this senior citizen center, you know, we're announcing we're having, you know, a gathering, please feel free to come. And I thought that was, and that speaks to Jody's point, you know, it's harder to promulgate false narratives face to face than it is on social media. So I thought that was a good thing that happened.
I'm going to try one more time. Can you guys hear me?
yes.
I can work technology. Anyway, thank you for bearing with me there for a second. I am originally from Waverly, and I don't live there now. I do live in Nashville currently. But I think some of this, one, I do think whoever spoke about fatigue, I do think fatigue after a disaster definitely sets in for folks. The volunteers, of course, that are there. And I feel like it's, when I think of response to disaster, it reminds me sometimes of response of friends to someone's death or family. You know, people are there at the beginning. They're there to comfort and support. But, you know, the hard times, if you've lost someone, is not necessarily right there at the beginning. It's that you have to keep moving on with that new reality, whatever that is. And I do think that the fatigue starts to set in. I will also say a couple of things about what I think is the mindset of the communities that plays a role. One, and I don't know if this is common amongst other folks, but definitely amongst the, as Miss Bobby, I think it was, I'm sorry if I got her name wrong, mentioned the regular old white country folk. Yes, Scots Irish settlers that came through, some of them building the railroad, and yes, that a lot of these people's families have been there for generations, but they don't want anybody to get something that they're not going to get themselves. So it's the idea that resources are going to be scarce, whether they are or not. And I also think in general, sometimes we have to, at least within those types of American communities, I definitely can't speak about immigrant communities, but there's a certain amount of entitlement that comes along with those, I think a lot of times, those communities. You know, I should get what everybody else is going to get. It should all be fair. I'm as entitled to this as anyone else. But because there's not a lot of racial or ethnic diversity necessarily in those areas, then you wind up having people, there's an us and them sometimes, but that occurs between socioeconomic groups. So a lot of the folks that you might see making snarky posts are people that are having to go more to some type of social service because they don't have the resources themselves. And so they may feel like it's the haves are not helping us, you know, anymore. The people, the haves in our own community are okay, and they're not helping us anymore. You know, we're always the poor people, so they don't care if we have anything or not. That's kind of a harsh way to say it, but that's the best way I can articulate it at the moment, y'all. And then I think that you also then, because you do have in many ways a very homogenous community with families that have been there for generations, people do wind up helping their smaller communities or families. You will find churches, of course, that may open up to everybody, at least at the beginning, but ultimately they're going to take care of the people they already know. The church itself is going to take care of those church members. This particular, you know, school group may do it with those. So they kind of, even though it's a smaller, and I keep saying the same thing over and over again, even though it is a smaller and more homogeneous community, there are still ways that people find to separate themselves. Okay, thank you.
No, absolutely. Great points, Melinda. I think, you know, it's something that we grapple with. It's, you know, privilege, entitlements, us versus them, us versus us, the segmentations of our communities. I mean, this is reality in every community. You create these subsegments, which then kind of pit themselves against each other. And so how do you move beyond that? And I think social media has played a role in continuing to spread disinformation and leading to divisions and polarization. At the same time, being a source for good. A lot of the recovery efforts, getting news out, allowing people to stay connected. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword with it. And so it's a difficult conversation, but I think it's one that why we've launched our 3142 program, which helps create local task forces in county at the county level, and where community members and stakeholders from a community come together to address an issue within their community. And Daniel Collins, who's on the call, he's our new 3142 program coordinator. So if you're interested in creating a task force in your community, please let us know. And we'll get you in touch with Daniel and we'll let you know as we try to expand and scale our program. But our goal is to bring communities together at a very local grassroots level so they can hear each other, so they can understand each other, so they can address an issue that's affecting them and move beyond the polarization and division that's spreading across the nation.
I would like to say something. Listening to Jody and then to Melinda, I just got this idea of something that could happen in the Waverly community now. And maybe it is happening and I just haven't heard about it, but it could be useful at this point, I think, to bring people together to tell their personal stories of what happened. You know, there's been some of that online and on videos and so on, and on the news, people telling their stories. But to do that, maybe even formally, storytelling events at local community centers and so on in Waverly, where you hear from this particular age group, this particular socioeconomic group, members of this particular family group. You know, I mean, hearing those stories, I think, might make a difference.
You know, ironically, you say that because a lot of our organizing is storytelling. You know, and it is what we do best. And we found with your stories, people connect with you because then you feel you're of the same. And that is ironic, though, that you said that, because we also at NJOP bank stories from people who want to do them by video or want to do them by letter. And we build with your stories, and we take your stories, if it's something we're working with disaster relief, to our legislators. And that is one of the ways we make change, policy change. So you're absolutely right. Storytelling not only works in the community, but on the legislative level.
Yeah, and I just sent into the chat their collection of stories. Jody has one that I sent in earlier, so if y'all want to check that out, that's right over there. And with that, since we're coming up on time, I'll just close us out. Thank you guys so much. Thank you all for attending and for sharing. And a huge thanks to our panelists, Jody and Luis. We'd also like to thank you guys for coming in and sharing during the breakout sessions. This has been like a great conversation with a lot of great first steps sort of outlined. And so before we close out for today, please take our pledge to listen if you haven't done so yet. You'll find the link for that in the chat. I'll put it in just a second. The pledge to listen is sort of that basic first step, pledging to listen to somebody else's perspective, regardless of this perspective that you come from. If you're interested in getting involved in participating in our upcoming trainings for community listening facilitators, or if you want to get involved with creating a local task force with the 3142 program, as Remziya mentioned, again, please reach out to us at Millions of Conversations. I'll drop our website down in the bio, though I'm sure you're all familiar with us by now. And thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.